So pay careful attention to this next part because this will be important for the rest of the course. What I'm about to introduce to you is the concept of binary oppositions or dualisms or dichotomies. And these binaries will prove to be like a recurring villain in this course. Maybe not the ultimate villain, which is probably power and discourse. But if you think of it like a movie or a video game, this is like the henchman of the villain, the mid boss as opposed to the end boss that we'll have to fight several times throughout this course. So our language is built in a way that categorizes our experiences into simple binary oppositions, such as good, bad, black, white, male, female, mind, body, this or that, young or old, structure or agent, active or passive, rich or poor, subject or object, nature or culture, day or night, left or right, us or them. These are the categories that we use through language to define our experiences. And they're very limiting categories. They only give us two choices, whereas our experiences are a lot more multifaceted than that. This is because I think I alluded to this on the week on semiotics, but our brains like simplicity. The fact that our actual experiences are so complex and multifaceted can give us a sense of existential dread and anxiety and overwhelmingness. But to be able to divide these disjunctive experiences into simple categories gives us a sense of comfort and control. So it's just easier to say, that's a good person and that's a bad person, or that's part of the structure and that's part of our agency, or that's part of nature and that's part of culture, without thinking of the nuances and how things could potentially be both. There are people who are good and bad, believe it or not. There are aspects of nature that are culturally constructed. There are aspects of our structures that are shaped by agents. It's not so simple and cut and dry, but our language makes it so and thus shapes our experiences. And this limits the way we can think about ourselves and think about others and everything and identify ourselves and others and everything in existing discourse, as we can meaningfully only be one or the other. There's no in between. When oftentimes our experiences don't neatly and simply fall into one or the other category. And that's another one right there, the binary opposition of one and the other, like the quote from de Beauvoir on the previous slide, man is the one, woman is the other. So the limits for identifying ourselves and our gender are always set within the terms of this hegemonic cultural discourse that's predicated on binary structures that appear to us as the language of universal rationality, that seem to us as being the true way of categorizing our experiences and categorizing others and ourselves. And take a look at all the binary oppositions on this slide and think about the fact that one of those terms usually takes precedence over the other. One of them is in a position of dominance and power, and the other one is relatively subjugated. It's in the subservient position, such as male over female, or good over bad, or mind over body, or white over black. Like white is associated with purity, and black is associated with evil, or young over old, or rich over poor. These categories themselves, these binary oppositions are imbued with unequal power relations, as one side tends to take a position of superiority and privilege, while the other is rendered subordinate in the relationship, ensuring that there are winners and losers depending on what side of the binary you are categorized into within discourse and society. So it's not just a neutral thing to be categorized as one or the other. If you're categorized as the one, you have power over the other. You are in a position of superiority and privilege and have more ability than if you were on the flip side of the coin and are the other, who is defined in relation to the one. So it's important to keep in consideration the origins of these categories because, like everything in language, they're not natural, they are socially constructed. So we need to consider who in discourse is providing us with these categories through which we interpret our experiences and give meaning to them. And perhaps more importantly, why? Who benefits from being on one side of the binary versus the other? And what sort of power inequalities are at work in these simple aspects of our language? So with that notion of binary oppositions in mind, let's explore the construction of the binary opposition that's most relevant to this reading, the one versus the other. So according to de Beauvoir, the category of the other is as primordial as consciousness itself. In the most primitive of societies, in the most ancient mythologies, one finds the expression of a duality, that of the self and the other. Otherness is a fundamental category of human thought. So this feature of language has been a part of every society, even before societies, even when we were just nomadic tribes. It's how people identify with those around us as an us, and everyone else outside of that as a them. It's kind of an evolutionary survival mechanism to be able to operate on that duality of the self and the other, or the us and the them. If it weren't for this, then tribes would have been overrun by other tribes for lack of ability to differentiate between safety and threats, and to build up walls and barricades and protective mechanisms between the us and the them, between the community and its outsiders. And this duality of selfness and otherness continues to present day. So if you're an American, for example, you'll have a lot of pride for your country and camaraderie with fellow American citizens, and contrastingly, potentially a lot of hostility with those outside of America, with the others to America, such as during the Revolutionary War, the Americans saw the British as the other. And then during the Cold War, the Americans saw the Soviet Union and communism as the other. And then in the late 20th, early 21st centuries, during the wars in the Middle East and whatnot, then Middle Easterners were seen as the other by America. And now, in present day, it's probably China that's been otherized in the eyes of Americans. So this instinctual tendency to distinguish between self and other leads to things like nationalism and xenophobia. Thus, according to de Beauvoir, it's that no one group ever sets itself up as the one without at the same time setting up the other over and against itself. If three travelers were to occupy the same compartment on a train, that's enough to make vaguely hostile others out of all the rest of the passengers on the train. It's just this psychological mechanism that if you have a one, if you have the self, then there must be something against which the self is defined. Because if you don't have that foil, then how do you define yourself? Like we were talking about with dissocier, meaning is relational. So that even if you go on a train and you're just randomly assigned a compartment with two other strangers, then already you're forming a sort of a team, an us. And everyone else on the train who's not a part of that team is an other. Not that you're going out and like stealing food from other compartments or declaring war on them or directly antagonizing them, but like the quote says, it just makes vaguely hostile others where you may be a bit uncertain or standoffish when you're interacting with anyone else on the train that isn't a part of the team of your compartment. Again, it's just this thing our minds tend to do, and I think it did somewhat develop evolutionarily as a way, as like a defense mechanism and a way of preserving the species and furthering the species. And it's manifested itself in the way we think and the categories that our thinking places our experiences into. So women are very much otherized in and by society, but so are all other marginalized groups on the basis of culture or ethnicity. Various minorities and social castes are cast out as others. In the reading, de Beauvoir identifies African Americans and Jewish people as others in our societies, but they don't even have to be exogenous to our societies. They could be indigenous, like literally indigenous people are otherized without necessarily ever having to be external to our societies. It's kind of a domestic otherization as opposed to the other example of Americans often choosing external threats and rival countries as the others. But de Beauvoir does make note of a distinction between women and members of these other cultural groups, because members of these groups can, at the very least, identify with one another in solidarity and recall a time before, like slavery for the African Americans or the Jewish diaspora, when these groups were independent in order to see themselves as subjects and reverse that otherization process. Women, on the other hand, can't point to a time in the past when they weren't subordinated. It's not like there was an event in history where women were put into this subordinate position that women can look back to and look at the time before that event and reclaim some subjectivity within that. And not only that, but women are dispersed amongst the households and communities of men. They don't have a homeland that they can travel back to embrace their roots as women, the same way African Americans can do with Africa or Jewish people can do with Israel. It's not like there's an island of women out there that all women originally came from and that women can return back to. So that women are more likely to be divided against each other and to identify with their oppressors more than with each other. So if you're a woman and you were raised by, your father and uncles and other male figures and grew up with brothers and then married a man and then raised sons of yourself, then you're going to see males as the us. You're going to see them as on your team in terms of the train compartment. You're going to identify with men as the us and may see other women as the them, especially in a discourse that tends to pit women against each other as potential competitors vying for the love of a man. It's hard to find solidarity with women and thus establish sovereignty for women. So it can be hard for women to see themselves and other women as a we. Same way African Americans or Jewish people or the proletariat economic class can see themselves and unite accordingly as a we. Like that's how the proletariat asserts power. They unite as we, the proletariat, and we, the working classes, and thus otherize the bourgeoisie, the dominant economic classes. But like I mentioned in the Waves of Feminism slide, the we for women is like a very small academic intelligentsia, just a very small and limited and exclusive group of feminist thinkers who claim to speak for all women. So it's a problematic situation for women if they can't identify themselves and other women as a we who are involved and embroiled in a collective struggle against another other, that is men. They lack the concrete means to organize themselves as a unit that can stand face to face with the correlative unit of man. So women don't have that built-in solidarity that other groups do. And society is structured for them to be more liable to compete against each other rather than unite for each other, with each other, for a common purpose. And what are women to do about the situation? Like the proletariat as an economic class can threaten to wipe out the bourgeoisie and the ruling economic classes, but women can't threaten to just like nuke all men and destroy all men. First of all, because there's no like centralized geographical area of only men that they could nuke. Women live dispersed amongst men. And also, if they kill all men, then there goes the species. Well, not necessarily, because sperm banks are a thing. But yeah, when it comes to men, it's kind of a I can't live with them, can't live without them problem. So yeah, it's a problematic situation to be in when the bond that unites you to your oppressors is so strong. and so seemingly natural. And as a result of this lack of concrete resources for women to unite as an us, as a we, as a self, set up against an opposing other, then women begin to see themselves as an other, as an object, and accept this otherization of themselves in sort of a self-alienation where they're alienated from their own identity and their own potential as social agents.